All right, well, welcome everybody to another edition of our weekly Journalist Roundtable for June 5th, 2020. This is Bob Ambrogi, and I will be once again serving as the moderator today and the host today. This has been, as everybody knows, a tough week, and it almost seems besides the point to be talking about legal technology, I think, for some of us, but it's a week when issues of race and injustice have dominated the news and dominated our thoughts. And it's, of course, a painful reality. I think that the legal tech industry, broadly speaking, has a diversity problem of its own, one I don't know that we talk enough about. I know that in 2018, Kristen Sonde, a co-founder of Paladin, did a study of diversity among founders in legal tech when she found that Black and Latinx founders account for a staggeringly low proportion of legal tech entrepreneurs, just 2.3% and 3.1% respectively. I'm also aware that this panel has a diversity problem. We've been meeting for a few weeks now, and if you look at the composition of this panel, we clearly have a diversity problem, and that's my fault. I'm to blame for that. I'm the one who's invited the people to be part of this panel, and I certainly want everybody to know that I'm sorry about that, and I pledge that we're going to do our best to remedy that going forward. But in light of the week's news, what we've done is something a little bit different today, which was that we've invited a guest who is himself a co-founder and CEO of a legal tech startup. And it's a legal tech startup that is very much focused on diversity in the legal industry. And it's also, he also happens to be the author of an article that he published this week on the American Lawyer, entitled "What the Death of George Floyd Should Teach the Legal Industry." So welcoming to our panel, Bryan Parker. Bryan, how are you?
Good, Bob. Thanks for having me in and for this conversation.
Yeah. And we're going to get back to Bryan in just a second, but let's just do our usual quick go around of introductions here so we all know who's here. Nicole Black, you want to start?
Sure. I'm Nicole Black. I am the legal technology evangelist with MyCase. That essentially means I am the bridge between lawyers and technology, internally and externally. Externally, I am a journalist, write a lot about, a legal tech journalist of sorts. I write on a lot of different platforms, including ABA Journal, Above the Law, The Daily Record, and the MyCase blog.
Zach?
Hey there, everybody. My name is Zach Warren. I'm the editor-in-chief of ALM's Legal Tech News, anything at the intersection of law and technology for the company that also has the American Lawyer, Corporate Counsel, and other publications under our umbrella.
And let's see, Caroline.
Hi there, Caroline Hill, editor-in-chief of Legal IT Insider. Based in the UK, but with global coverage. And as I always say, AKA we're known as the Orange Rack.
Right. Joe.
Yeah, Joe Patrice from Above the Law. I have nothing really fun to add to that, actually, I guess. Yeah, I feel like I'm letting everybody down with that one.
All right.
Like everybody else has like cool, like, oh, and this and this and this. And I'm like, oh, Above the Law. Like,
but you've got a dinosaur on your shoulder.
I was going to say.
There is a dinosaur. Yes, there is a dinosaur.
So now it's coming with you.
All right. And last but never least, Molly McDonough.
I'm Molly McDonough. I'm a media consultant and former editor and publisher of the ABA Journal, blogging about legal affairs issues, especially access to justice at a just society. And I will push back on your statement about legal tech and the issues of today, because especially in the access to justice area, technology is one of the most important tools to that we can use to decrease barriers, increase access, and scale lower cost legal services. So that's where my focus is.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure you're disagreeing with me. I was just really talking more about the composition of some of especially the among the founders and the management and even the people who work in legal tech. You go to ABA Tech Show or you go to some of the conferences, and there is a real diversity issue, I think. But Bryan, maybe you could. I mean, you can probably talk to that a little bit, but maybe you could just set the stage for us by telling us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I don't have a cool dinosaur in the background, but when you rip this virtual background away, I've got a cool painting. So maybe next time. I think most of us are in some level of angst, sadness, anger, trying to make sense of what's been going on this last week and a half since we all saw on national TV. George Floyd murdered at the hands of the police, and so where does that bring us? I'm a Black CEO. Obviously, we can see that. I started in law at Sherman and Sterling in the M&A group. I did investment banking for about 8 years. Tech was my area, and then I've been on operations for over the last decade. As a CEO of a venture-backed tech company before moving to DC to found this with John Greenblatt, who was my mentor way back as a summer associate when I was still at NYU. So maybe we'll talk about the power of mentoring and that sort of thing. I think what I'd just like to say as a quick introduction is for a lot of the Black associates, partners, your friends. That sort of thing. This moment, it feels like a culmination, right? Because a lot of people have said, "What's different about where we are?" Right? We had the same reaction with Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and the whole lineage. I think people are have reached a breaking point of sorts, and so it might sound odd that as a lawyer, and particularly an M&A one, I start off with a very touchy-feely statement saying that your Black colleagues and friends are not all right, right? So when I sat down, part of writing the piece was to have some cathartic event for myself personally and for some of my friends. As I started talking about it with my business partner, we said, there may be some lessons here that we can share with the broader industry. We, as far as the legal industry, I think we've got two challenges, Bob, and you talked about the diversity. Diversity and inclusion cuts, I think, across a lot of different, avenues in our industry, and I think we should talk about that. But I also, as we go on in the piece to talk about, I think that the legal industry, and I take Molly's point, because of technology, I think we can democratize a lot of processes and give access to where people didn't have them before. But lawyers have, I think, in our midst, a lot of privilege, a lot of access to resources, and just a lot of know-how. And for the people that did go to law school, and I challenge my colleagues, many of us wrote on those statements way back when we were trying to go to law school. Well, I want to make a difference in the world. I want to save. I want to give a voice to the voiceless. I don't make fun of those things. I said some of the similar things. And so I guess I asked the question, is our industry maybe, position as the first amongst equals to try to pick up this mantle? And I'll just close the opening point with, many of you have read a lot of what Baldwin wrote, and this particular, I think it was in the late 50s, it was at a debate in Cambridge. And coming out of that, he made the quote that a lot of people have hung on to, saying that to be Black in America is to be in a constant state of rage. So when you're looking out and the first challenge is, right, like we try to understand then be understood, as we're trying to go through and wrestle with our own emotions, I think the first thing that we need to do for our colleagues, for our friends, for our workplaces, is to look at the humanity of the situation and just realize what people are going through. Try to talk that out. Let's try to do some healing. And then we have some very specific steps. And again, I don't claim, and John doesn't claim to be the experts on any of this, but we do think that there needs to be a real frank and direct dialogue about what is a very thorny subject so that we can get about making progress.
I want to just invite my fellow panelists here to go ahead and chime in if you have points or questions you want to raise. But I just to follow up on what you were saying, one thing I wanted to ask Bryan, I mean, it does somehow feel like a turning point, and yet I'm old enough to have been at a few places along my life when it's felt like a turning point, and then somehow things fall back into the way they were. And how do we make sure this really is a turning point? How do we keep this momentum going, whether in the legal profession or more broadly?
Yeah, so I think that's the question of the hour, right? And that's why I think it's a twofold challenge. It's a challenge for our industry, but I think we have a broader challenge to be a part of a solution in society. The short answer is I don't know, right? So my mom grew up in the rural South. She was in a town about 2 hours outside of Atlanta. And she was the first person, the area is called Rome, Georgia, for anybody that knows that area. And she was the first person of color, black child, to integrate her high school there in East Rome, Georgia. And that was an incredibly tough, process for her. Made the strides, graduated college, got a master's degree, helped raise 2 kids largely on her own. And I remember a point in 2008, going into whatever the election results were announced. I think it was the end of 2008 when Barack was president. And I just remember stepping out of the party that I was at, and just hearing her crying and joining in the crying and saying, for this now 72-year-old Black woman, I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime, right? Well, we're a short 10, 12 years later, and we're in the same lifetime, and maybe we've given back that support. And that's why I said, I don't know. But the question that we have to, one of the questions I think, or in the series of questions, how do we look at the apparatus in society and drive systemic change? How, when we stop looking at CNN and reading the newspapers and all the great stuff that this group is putting out, do we make sure that people are still focused on the work so that it's not just a moment in time where we see people marching and we have this crisis of conscience as a country and as an industry, and we don't look up in another 4 or 8 years and there's not been the progress. So I think it's the healing. I think it's the conversation. I think it's the direct points of action that we're all thinking about. But I'm sort of a big data and accountability person as a leader. What are those, how are we going to measure this progress? How are we going to have checkpoints? How are we going to hold each other accountable so that when we do look back, we can come up, we can say 4 years, 10 years, whatever it was. Hey, we made progress in this area. And the first thing that we used to do, I ran a $1 billion division at a big healthcare company called DaVita. And we used to say, look, put your results up there and no explanation until after you explain the results, right? So it's, here are my 6 metrics. Either I met them or I didn't. Now, when we finish those, then we can go back and we can say this happened and this happened. But I think unless we are willing to engage with brutal honesty and willing to commit to accountability, no more, sort of squishy platitudes and that sort of thing, I'm not sure how the change, how we don't look up in another 4 years and there's unfortunately another George Floyd or Trayvon or name Breonna Taylor, right? I mean, women are not immune from this at all. In our community, they've been the leaders. So, they're getting the short end of the stick and then having to do a lot of the work. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think if we're committed, and I'm sorry to go on, last point I'll say, is that I think it will take, like you said, the opposite of your comment where you said we need more diversity. I'm actually glad that we have a group that looks like this, and I hope that the audience listening is made up like this as well. And I say that for this point. We need allies that are going to help make the change, right? No matter how loud we scream as Black people, we can't make the change alone. And, I'm sure most people have seen it or remember it from their civics lessons of Ben Franklin saying, we don't get to this change until the people that are unaffected care as much about it as the people that are affected.
Do any of the
Yeah, I'll just jump in on something Bryan said that I think is important here, and that's I mean, so much of it is, but one point that I think I want to emphasize is the change being a big focus on solutions and not a lot of talk and hypotheticals. It's these last few months with COVID, and then the protests and demonstrations have really laid bare a lot of the problems and made clear to so many what some of the solutions are, and there's just no excuse at this point, and there wasn't an excuse before, but I see more resolve and emphasis on solutions. I say that, and then what the next horror story comes on my TV or my feed. So I want to be optimistic, but I am seeing kind of more collaboration, more solutions-oriented discussions, and action, especially in the courts, and out of necessity.
I think it's a really interesting point but I mean, there's so many different things to think about, and I really like your point, Bryan, about the metrics, and Molly, definitely take your point about let's not just talk about one positive step already, I think, is that I think the legal sector is definitely silent on the topic of race often. Like, I think that there has not been anywhere near enough conversation, and although conversation is just the starting point, I think it's I think that just the fact that law firms have come out with some meaningful statements, and I was quite impressed by United Lex. Dan Reed, the CEO, posted a letter that he'd sent to all of the employees. Not just, I mean, it was talking about it, but goes to perhaps, Bryan, your point about commitments, and they say, they just discuss how they're moving forward, who they're supporting, which organisations they're supporting, and how they're trying to make a difference. And I've been quite encouraged by that, and I think that this for me has been a challenging week in all sorts of ways, in that trying to work out how we can help and how we position it. Because for me personally, so it's been a heartbreaking week, and I made this point on social media very genuinely, and someone quite fairly, really with hindsight, shot me down and said, "It's not about you." We don't care if you're heartbroken, it's not about you. And I was like, oh my God, I don't. So I think we can all learn from each other as to how we should be making a difference, because those of us who are well-meaning maybe don't get it right, and I think that it's for all of us to try to help educate each other. And by having conversations like this, I find it really helpful.
Yeah, I don't want to cut others off. I do want to make a quick response to that, Caroline. And first, I should say, obviously, thank you for the empathy and pouring your heart out. I think as a part of these conversations, and well, John, my co-founder, and I were on the Three Geeks podcast yesterday. Okay, and so we did it with their permission, but we did it very intentionally, right? John is white Jewish guy. I'm who I am. And Carolyn, this goes to your point of hard, brutal conversations, but what John and I say, and we have a history, right? So it's a little bit easier, but we wanted to show if it's possible with us, it's possible with a larger group. And that is that people have to have a safe space. They have to be able to speak their unmitigated truths, right? So you're in pain. Yeah, great. We're not going to dispute that. You have some things to offer. Maybe you say, well, what about this or what about that? We have to speak truth to power. And as a leader, the last thing that I'll allow to happen is have anybody come to the table and be shouted down in the way that you were on social media, because I think what that does is that we have people that are maybe on the edge, and you're not on the edge, and you're an ally, and you want to help, but people that are on the edge get that kind of feedback, or they say the wrong word, or they are already nervous, and then they retreat. So by retreating, we don't have as full a conversation as possible. Do I think that I talk about top-down and bottom-up leadership, and when we get into the law firm, clearly, let's just say I went into the law firm tomorrow and they're like, okay, you're a great guy, you know M&A, you can bring in some clients or whatever, great. Am I going to be the senior partner the next day? No. So there's still going to be some top-down management. My point of the movement more generally is that we have to let a bunch of the Black voices lead. In our hierarchical structures of law firm, we have to listen to the Black voices and let them be a part of the solution, not just create it in a vacuum and then force it down. That won't work. But there has to be room for everybody in this struggle, because we just create better outcomes when we have people at the table. And by the way, we're talking about Black people in particular right now because of George Floyd. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, I'm talking to the 3 women that are here. We have stuff tries to go there too, right? So I would make the same comment as a man. When we're talking about inclusion on that side, I should be able to say and voice my authentic opinion, but there should be women that are at the front leading and making the solutions, and us having this conversation. I think respect is the word that we always talk about, respecting the viewpoints and the voice that people are bringing to the table. And if we can do that, I was, last point, I went to NYU for law school, and the associate, fellow alum on the, I knew if I did enough of these, I'd find one out there, so that's good. So I was talking to our associate dean of placement, and she says, God, I've been thinking about this. I've read your piece 3 times since it came out. We sent it to the student body, and maybe some of that is because I'm an alum. We were getting on the phone, and she called at 10:07 at night, to talk about some, I mean, she's in charge of placement, right? So we were talking about our model and students and that sort of thing. Didn't touch on it. One point, Carolyn, this goes to you. I felt in that moment that I had an ally. She had talked about her daughter, and which is pretty much a very white suburb in New York, made a Black Lives Matter sign, put it in the yard, and said, I want you to know all are safe here. And it's a moment that made her mom both proud and sad that she had to put that up. But Irene and I had this conversation where there was more healing. We will come back, and we're scheduled on Monday to talk about the business and talk about strategies. But sorry, I probably am overstating this. I think we all have a voice, and the voices that come to the table need to be respected, because the marginal ones that may lean into this, they're going to scatter the moment that they're shouted down or said that they're not using the right words or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing I really like about the put out all your metrics, like argument, like framing of it that you put up, is that one conversation that I often have with folks is that one of the problems with activism and allyship is that part of bringing a lot of people together is you usually strategically focus around one goal, which tends to be a floor. And then after that floor is achieved, it can lose some steam. Yeah. And so having multiple vectors, basically, of dealing with these issues, it's not, having cops extrajudicially murder people is obviously a floor, but when that gets solved, that doesn't mean that we have solved, advancement within law firms, which is a problem too. And it may seem insignificant compared to the other, but all of these vectors have to kind of be attacked at once, and we can't lose sight of the fact that they all are part of taking on a superstructure, kind of. So I really like that multiple metrics kind of argument for trying to bring people to this fight going forward.
Yeah, and one of the ways I try to lead, Joe, I think it's beautifully said. I went to a course at the Stanford Business School years ago, and they talk about setting big, bold, audacious goals. So every time we're doing something with our team, we have goals, we have metrics, but one of them, and I see, Zach kind of was smiling a little bit, I throw it out, and if I don't have a goal that makes somebody like sit back in their chair like, oh God, this guy's at it again, right? Well, maybe it's 1 out of 30 times or whatever the percentage is, but to your point, if you're not at some point looking to see how high your ceiling is, then we're going to rise only as far as the floor. So, well said.
Yeah, when it comes to metrics, that's something that has popped up in our reporting. It almost seems like it's a chicken or the egg scenario of if you're a legal tech provider, you're not being asked for these metrics, so you're not putting them together. But on the other side, corporate clients or what have you are saying, yeah, we're not asking for these metrics because people aren't putting them together. We don't know what data they have. They don't know what data they have. So it's a matter of somebody actually taking the initiative. And it's a story I actually don't think it's out yet. But one of our reporters talked to somebody who did exactly what you were saying, Bryan, and said, okay, so we said 40%, that is our goal for diverse staff. If you don't have it, you're not going to work with us. And he learned very quickly that the providers were able to get those numbers together if they had initiative. So it's just a matter of somebody actually taking that first step.
Yeah. And one of the points that, given that you guys are focused on tech law, the last company that I was at was SaaS marketing. And I think that there's room for the emergence of sort of a SaaS legal provider. And just imagine like the conference Legal Week that we were all at. We have studies that show that every time you're at one of those conferences, we get 186 different points of data, right? Only a subset of those are actionable. So we create reports, we get that to the decision makers, whether it's the chief marketing officer, CFO, CEO kind of thing. And imagine that in a world of law that you're saying, especially in a world that's going to go more remote. Here's where my employees are. This is how productive they are. This is who's at whatever percent of utilization. This is the profit, all of the targets and that sort of thing. And I think you got to, law is and this is probably an understatement, a very traditional business. So when you get alternative legal service providers, and you talked about United Lex, there's, Elevate and others that are trying to push the thinking, but it's a slow progress to innovation. So I think your point is a smart one about, well, two points. What is the data that's actionable, and putting that in front of people and saying, oh, wow, like, yeah, this is kind of cool. And then getting folks used to, and we're changing, right? We're in the middle of this shift where folks that had John's age and experience are still leading, but they're starting to retire. And then being the next generation that are coming up, and certainly the one that's behind me, are a lot more tech and tool savvy. So how do we get people used to using the devices, using the data, informing that behavior? Because I had that experience. One of the things that we're doing in the background is thinking about a lot of AI and machine learning as it can inform the hiring process. But there's actionable data that I know that the people in charge of law firms can use. So we're going to have an app that will come out at some point. I won't give a date to put pressure on our developer, but we're going to have an app that'll come out that will start with, here's the client, here are the, all the constituencies, here's our students. So it'll start getting people used to seeing the app, seeing the reports, and from there we can build on, we can customize and that sort of thing. But I do think data for data's sake makes people's eyes roll back. If you can give data that I can use, this is telling me a story, and I can better run my business or achieve an objective. Here we're talking about diversity and inclusion. Those are the kinds of things that I think people will gravitate to and be sticky. But you've got to do it within the psychology of innovation of these law firms and corporations. Corporations a little bit faster, law firms a little bit slower, but that doesn't mean they won't come along.
Bryan, on that issue of diversity, I know that your company is focused on helping to build and enhance diversity within law firms. But as somebody who has been a serial entrepreneur, do you have any thoughts on how the legal tech industry can do a better job of diversifying the ranks of the people who are coming up in the industry? On the industry side, as I said earlier, the statistics show startlingly low numbers of people of colors who have been founders of legal tech companies. How do you begin to remedy that? How do you begin to increase the diversity of people who are working in these companies and building these companies?
Yeah, well, God, I wish if I had the perfect answer, but I guess I'd be a lot richer than I am.
That could be your second startup.
Yeah, thank you. I'll put that one in the background. Well, look, I guess, and I'd love to hear what other people think. I have some perspective on this, right? Because I spent a lot of my career in Silicon Valley as a banker, and then working in tech companies, and we've seen this, right? We saw consumers drive change at some of the big tech companies, Facebook, Google, and LinkedIn, and saying, well, wait a minute, you're driving a disproportionate percentage of your revenue from this community, right? But we don't see any Black engineers, startup founders, all the things that you're saying. I don't think that the startup in Silicon Valley and the startup legal community, sort of larger, and especially on the East Coast, is all that different, or across the pond. And maybe Carolyn could speak to that a little bit better than I could. But it's what's coming up and who's coming up in the pipeline. I think we were just talking about this earlier today, Bill Henderson, and his approach of reaching back certainly to college at least, and I think maybe he's also reaching back to high school, though somebody could correct me on that, and saying, look, we've got to, if we want to increase the diversity, and this is not tech bot, but if we want to increase the diversity in associates and partners and that sort of thing, we've obviously got to have a lot more law school ready people, and then people that come out of law school that are then big firm ready. So we need to, as an industry, reach back further to make sure, well, one, people are exposed to those careers. Do you want to be a lawyer? A lot of people say that. Do you want to develop technology? Can you see these two loves coming together? I think it's starting earlier in the pipeline. We talk about STEM programs a lot. Maybe even it's getting overused at this point. But again, let's go back to the metrics that Joe and Zach and I were just talking about and saying, are in terms of the STEM courses and things that are being offered and where they are and how diverse those areas are. And are we addressing things like the digital divide? We're jumping right into STEM and saying, hey, look, let's teach how to code and operate and that sort of thing. And we've got to ask, do certain families have access to the internet at their house, right? So I think it's that. I think it's making funding available for people to be able to take some of these STEM courses, mentorship. Look, we've part of our model is based on the European system of apprenticeship, right? So we are taking young lawyers and we're placing them with corporations and with law firms for 2 years under the theory that people still need to learn. It's no different than baseball in the minor leagues and taking people that could one day be tech startups or engineers or whatever and pairing them with people where they can get practical experience. Facebook does a good job of this. I have friends that are in high school and they started working for Facebook and some of these internship programs, hardly any diversity in those programs. And so what the metrics can then allow us to do is say, well, what are the numbers that we want to have? How do we drive those results? And it's funny, I'll go back to Zach's comment. I always say this, and my bosses have said this to me, that what we measure ends up becoming true. These are the results that we end up seeing. So let's measure the right things that we want to see change, and then let's contribute to them. If you saw the George Floyd memorial yesterday, and I think you'll hear this from a lot of Black leaders, not to make this religious, but Al Sharpton says, look, we're not saying let's turn the tables and let's be 95% in charge and put our feet on other people's necks or any of that stuff. Let's take the foot off of our neck and have an equal chance to succeed. And we're talking about education here. One of the things as a lawyer that I always share with high school and college students that I get a chance to talk to is Brown versus Board of Education decision, right? Let's talk about education because that is our job training, playground. When was Brown decided? How many years are we after that? 60 plus years. I'm not quizzing you guys, I'm saying.
66.
Okay, thank you. So we're a long way. And remember the two of the things that I always leave with every group out of that decision, by definition, separate can't be equal, right? Make these changes, this was in the dicta, make these changes with all deliberate speed. Tell me in what world all deliberate speed equals 66 years. This is why we have to measure things and hold people accountable, because if we do, then we start seeing the changes. Not saying this won't take a long time, but 66 years just to reform the secondary up to high school, or the primary up to high school, excuse me.
Yeah.
Well, the thing, so when you talk about metrics, How, and I understand this idea that you need to have the numbers and then with the metrics will come change, but I think that the thing that is, and you also talked about rage, and I think the thing that is so frustrating and that causes so much rage is that you can have the metrics, but if the attitudes don't change and it's taking so long for them to change, you'll keep thinking, all right, the next generation. It can't be generational. But I don't know if you saw the story about how LinkedIn had a diversity event that was online. And in the middle of the diversity event, in the comments, there were all these obtuse racist comments, you know, in the middle of a diversity event. I mean, how is that? They couldn't even be quiet then. And these were people that were working at LinkedIn. And so at what point, I mean, I think what you're seeing now is this rage overflowing, and because it's taking too long. And how do you, and I guess I also wanted to ask about, I mean, that's commentary. I also wanted to ask about being an effective ally and how you do that when it isn't it's our problem, but it's not our voice that needs to be heard. And how, you know, I'm enraged. I think we're all enraged, but you don't know what to do effectively. And I know the article touches on that a little. So I was kind of hoping you would share a little bit of some of those things, just so that in case people haven't read your article, they'll have a sense of some things that can be done, but also just what do you do when you have this rage, but it's not your voice? And how do you be an effective ally when really you shouldn't be in the front seat? You should be in the back seat, supporting, but not overstepping.
I think it's well stated, and you know, I would say that you know, I don't know if it's a back seat. I think it's maybe right beside me or beside us. You know, because certainly we look at the civil rights, and a lot of the friends that we have as a family, given that my mom was involved in the civil rights, are Jewish people, right? They have a shared experience. They walked right beside us. They helped. My partner is Jewish. She kind of continues. I guess I'm saying that there's a lot of people out there that want this to happen. And so tangibly, well, what can allies do? And I'll come back to the rage point. John is, after this, like, he's struggling himself, right? Like, and he's working through this, and he's come up, and we'll release it soon. He says, what can I do? This is the question that he's asking as a 65-year-old, I think, hopefully I'm not saying this age wrong, but 60-something year old, you know, white guy that's had a lot of privilege, that sat at the tables of power, right? Like, he was on the policy committee for one of the biggest law firms in the world. He always used to make this analogy to me of like the country clubs, right? We're all in the country club. But if I bring you in, that doesn't diminish. We just have, you know, more people that are helping out. If I can do that and hold that door open, he's talked about getting into the community, learning what's going on the ground. Obviously, he's got, you know, he's made some means over the course of his career. What are those organizations that are doing the work? Because you guys are all journalists running companies, and I'm running a company, John is, and then we have some disposable time. But there's people that do this work full time. A couple that spring to my mind are the Equal Justice Initiative that's led by Brian Stevenson, right? Fantastic work in this area. And then related to them, sharing some similar spaces is Sherilyn Eiffel over at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And so I think Molly was talking in going back and forth with Bob about this technology and the diversity point at the beginning on voting. And so we have an election coming up. The victories that they're going to be able to do and amplify the power that they have because of some of the technology that exists on voting rights and IDs and making sure people don't get shut out. Those are things that we can do. So that's treasure, right? Time. If you're a lawyer, we can take out some pro bono work. If not, because I hope, and a lot of people were telling me that some of the predictions that we had or solutions are applicable beyond law. I mean, you could be an accountant, you could be a psychologist, you could be business, right? I was listening to AT&T's CEO the other day talk about the business roundtable, right? So they can drive from there. But to your point about the rage, you don't have to be black to have rage, right? You have to have a human being that has empathy for treating another person treated badly. And what I said to Irene, what she said to me is, let's get together on Monday. I need some time to continue to process this. And I am big on mental health. We don't talk about that enough, maybe a subject for another podcast. But the best law firms you see out there, the best companies now have wellness officers, right? They are doing and pushing things to their employees, physical fitness, talking to someone if you need to, identifying problems before they manifest itself. And this is another role for data. When I came in, there were staggering statistics about lawyers and the amount that we're going to have an experience with alcoholism. So if we know that up front, why are we not putting in programs to address the mental health that's leading to that substance? So I say to you and anybody else that's listening, take the time. You don't have to, I mean, Carolyn was saying this a minute ago, you don't have to apologize for that. This week, and usually like on the business this weekend, I'm like, I got to sit back mentally and go ride my bike and play with the dog. And then I'll have my cup full where I can come back and do more work. So quickly, there are a lot of voices with an incredible amount of privilege within the law. And I talk about leading from the front. You saw in a precedent-setting move, I believe, and we're going to see it play out in the trial of these officers, the chief of police of the Minneapolis police force fired them, asked why. He said unequivocally, these are crimes against humanity. What's there to think about, right? And so the people that matter, I said everybody matters, but the people that are in charge of our law firms, our corporations, the tone gets set from the top. So can you call this out? Can you unequivocally say that it is unacceptable not to have more representation look like society? That it's unacceptable not to have more people of color and women heading committees within the firm, being in the partnership. Then we start to measure those. What are specific goals that you would put in? You study corporations that have driven most diversity. The ones that are very successful lay out very clear metrics, and then they put the system of rewards to support what they're driving. So you're always rewarded on a P&L basis for meeting your budget. Well, that's good. If you're driving diversity at Coke or at Hilton, you will actually make more money in your bonus, and driven by structural change and real data, not just did you hold a webinar or something like that. And I think I talk in there too about going, so the leaders, the implicit bias training that we can do, that's super important. And I made this point early on, and I'll just finish with it. Top down, and I've talked a lot about the top down and what the top people can do because they do still set the tone. Bottoms up, right? This is our role again for data metrics. It's telling us the story. Look at the data and listen to the people that you're putting in stuff, putting in procedures and rules to try to help. Listen to them. They have a voice in this as well. Top down, bottom up, complemented by data.
Bob, I just real quickly want to echo some of that with I think it's going to be really hard for people to go back to work, see lack of diversity and injustices. And, you know, it would be hard for me not to call out as a reporter where I see a lack of diversity, a lack of justice in the system. I mean, as you all know, right. Bryan, not so much, but yeah. I'm somewhat passionate and obsessed with access to justice right now. And part of that is just this urgency that it's been too long, and we're creating this gap and this divide, and this systemic problem, this institutionalized problem needs solutions. And I just feel like now, going back into the work world, as people are going back into their offices, how can you not confront these issues, like Bryan was saying, head on? You're going to have these difficult conversations and figure out how to have them in a civil way, and, you know, make progress in your organizations. And I think that's all of our responsibility.
I think so too, and not be willing to wait, right? Like have the, everybody says like, stop quoting Martin Luther King, or we got other people we can quote, but in the fierce urgency of now, that's what you're talking about. I think we got to be restless. And I just wanted to make the quick comment because I was going back and forth with Gina over at ALM, and she was saying, hey, are the law firms the right ones to lead on this? Can they be a bastion for change? Molly, I think you make a great point. And what I said to her was, I think it's an ecosystem. I think it's law firms, but they're big, giant cruise tankers, right? Like it takes a lot to turn the ship. Okay, they've been successful. They do a lot of very good things. Maybe in terms of some of the smaller, more innovative companies like ours in this alternative legal service provider space, we have a role of offering some innovation. And then what I said to her, and I'll say to you guys, not to be self-serving just because I'm with journalists, accountability, right? I mean, you are best positioned, and maybe the only one's position, not the only ones, but your best position without fear of sort of reprisal, right? To look and say, when we are, because we have, and maybe Bob said this at the beginning, we have the unfortunate incident that has lit the country on fire on top of a pandemic. And so when we're doing furloughs and that sort of thing, are we asking the question, is it disproportionately impacting Black associates, partners, other associates of color? Is this an excuse to pull back on diversity and inclusion initiatives? I think those are the questions that we have to answer and that we have to try to measure. In our webinar on the 30th, we're going to tie diversity to profitability and cost, and try to say these are not mutually exclusive. Many GCs of the Fortune 500 are saying, if you don't bring us diverse teams, you're not going to get the business. So now we can have a seismic shift, because the lack of diversity is going to hurt your bottom line. So not only are they not mutually exclusive, they're tied together, I think, in a very good way. But you all will be the ones that write about it and give it voice, whether it is happening, whether it's not happening enough, whether it's happening too slowly. So I hope it sounds like this group is ready to hold people accountable, and I think we need some of that.
I think. Oh, sorry,
Go ahead, Carolyn.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. And I think that in terms of metrics, I think it's also important to have the long and the short term, isn't it? So I was interested in your point about STEM. So I organised a diversity with regard to women in legal tech. I organised a diversity meeting, and it became pretty clear. We had this amazing head of diversity for DLA at the time talk to us about the STEM issues and say, look, we can all rage about it now, but actually you have to go back and you have to be able to speak to people at schools, just as you were saying, Brian. Where I think the point I wanted to make about that was that, and it kind of relates to what Nikki was saying about whose voice they need to hear. Actually, I think that law firms need to be heavily involved in those kind of programs, because actually it's a big time commitment. And actually, if you end up being, if people of colour end up spending all of their time going back to schools, and actually that can affect their career. And I think that the law falls very heavily on law firms to make sure that that actually, I think that has to come from them, really, because actually it's a huge it's a huge commitment, as I experienced firsthand. It's hugely rewarding, actually, but I think they really need to do some deep digging into short-term goals, long-term goals, and actually really meaningful metrics, sort of how, and sometimes it's hard to sort of commit in terms of results, but actually as well, I think there needs to be some kind of commitment in terms of the results that they're looking for with educated people like yourself, inputting into that.
No, I don't know if I agree with everything you said. I'm not sure if you wanted me to respond to part of it. I think within your long and your short-term goals, though, if we can keep our minds on systemic change, right? Sustained change, and then realize, this was a point I used to make to people in business school, and this is a crude analogy, so don't take it strictly, because of course there are companies in the U.S. that do this. But in the U.S., we're looking at the next 4 quarters, right? Like, here's our guidance, and that sort of thing. In China and Japan, to a lesser extent, they're looking at the next quarter century. So when we go back and we look at economic data, well, economic data, I think, said that China was going to pass us as the world's biggest economy by like 2032 or whatever. Well, they beat that by, what, 14, 15 years. So I think we've got to give it, this is always the difficult change conversation, right? We are going to have to be able to take the long view. There's certain, as you said, with the short and the long term, but our measurements have to tie up to those two and celebrate the victories that we get along the way, but realize that if we're really talking about the next 20 years or so, I think that's what we're talking about. The change, I mean, you know, I don't know how old you are, Zach, but maybe Zach will still be around for that. I hope to be retired and maybe playing golf somewhere by the time that comes all the way through. But I think it's those long view, and I'll go back, you know, to the point that Nikki, I think, beautifully expressed. Is it within the culture of the firm and the firm's leadership to be and stay committed? Because those are the voices that can have outsized influence on this, but they're also the ones that are pulling the levers and making the decisions.
Yeah, and I think one other point that kind of pulls together what Molly's talking about, what Caroline's talking about, what you're talking about, Bryan, in terms of the metrics, is that I think the extent to which you are able to track these metrics for improvement in kind of any part of this picture, it spills over into the other parts. I mean, to the extent you're helping law firms, you know, using metrics to help law firms improve the way they serve clients and deliver legal services and become more diverse, that spills over into how you address the access to justice gap and to how you improve court services and better serve people in that community. And ultimately that starts to help inform even those parts of the justice system, such as how do we better train police to avoid the kind of situation that we've had and to make them more sensitive to you know, avoiding these kinds of issues, and how do we better understand how to respond when these kinds of things do happen, and how do we inform that? So I think we all have a long way to go on this, but it's interesting that I think metrics can really play an important role, and not something that people think about a lot.
Yeah, and maybe Bob, just, you know, as you were going there, because we've talked a lot about inside the law firm, what are we doing outside with a lot of lawyers that are very smart, have policy chops, do a lot of political giving, so we're connected that way. For the purposes of what we're talking about here, what I tried to say in the article is, let's throw out the labels, Democrat, Republican, Independent. I frankly don't care which one you are. Like, if we're friends, we can sit around and talk about this, right? But we don't need to have a decision about which party is right. You've got, let's just say there's a colleague that has access to a lot of Republican lawmakers, and I have some on the Democratic side. I think that the question becomes, to your point, Bob, are we driving the kind of change that's going to lead to the decrease in mass incarceration, things like bail for the poor, the chokehold, which that was just another version of. Hakeem Jeffries, who, you know, was a year behind me at NYU, now a congressman from New York, is introducing a bill that would make that a federal crime. So there's just so many ways that lawyers can show up. And again, it doesn't have to be any of the partisan battles. Like, what do we agree on that can drive some of this, change, and let's try to do it together.
Yeah. Bryan, I know you mentioned you're doing a program later this month on diversity. Do you want to tell us how we can find out more about that?
Yeah, thank you. It'll be surrounding you. We try to use social media, and we'll have some people. So our website is www.legal-innovators.com, and the registration link will be there, and it talks about the program. We'll be sending it out. Obviously, I'll personally send the links and background to all of you if you're willing to share with your networks, that's great. It's not going to just be legal innovators talking to people. We've got, as you might imagine, we've got an expert in data and analytics that's going to be on that. So Parker Analytics, not related to me, but Evan and I are, I guess, brothers from different mothers, as they say. Locklord, Safarth, The Belonging Project, NamWolf. So, and on the business side, I think this is important because, I went back and forth with Malai. He said, don't you want to, somebody in the legal? I said, no, we want somebody purely on the business to talk about this tie-in. And so Sekou, who is a friend of mine, he's a managing director over at JP Morgan Chase, and he leads their Advancing Black Pathways initiative. So we are hopeful that it's going to be a good program, and we're going to be there to listen too. We've made it 90 minutes just so we can interact with the audience, but we'll start by grounding people in the data. We will end by walking away with specific actionable items, some in the article, some not, and then talk about this question of how do we get it, keep it going, and how do we measure these things over time. So I hope everybody will join, and I'll just say, because I said at the beginning, we are also not trying to be the definitive experts like we know everything. I'll go back to Nikki's point. Can we bring in all these diverse voices and particularly have decision makers that are at the table so that while we're talking about this, we can have people that can go back and influence their organizations, whether those be law firms or corporations or nonprofits.
Well, we never got to our weekly news roundup this week, but I think this, I think we all agree that this was a much more important and valuable conversation to have had. And I think you really, Bryan, helped us maybe bring some closure to a rough week for all of us. And I really appreciate your taking the time. This wasn't on your calendar, I know. And so I really appreciate your making the time to share your thoughts and insights with us. It's really been great.
Well, we appreciate the audience, and I appreciate getting to meet everybody here and start to hijack your show.
Not at all.
Happy to be with anytime. I can come back and talk about technology going forward if you want. But I really do hope you all will participate in the webinar. And if you have questions that you want to be a part of what we're going to address, I'd be happy to take those.
All right.
Thank you, Bryan.
Any panelists have any closing thoughts before we wrap up here? I know we've gone long today.
Yeah.
I just want, when you said 20 years in the future, I just wanted to throw out there, I hope that this is a sign of immediate change or change very soon. I was a public defender from 95 to 99, and listen, we're 20 plus years past that, and it's, when it comes to criminal justice system and access to justice, and we're worse off than we were. LSC's been practically defunded, and hopefully this is going to be the instrument of a much quicker change, and I hope it's not 20 years.
Yeah.
I hope it's like 2, maybe 1.
Hats off to you, Nikki, and I think you're right, and hopefully it came across clear. But if not, I do think there's a number of things that we have to show in the short term. But my point about 20 years is that there's probably some longer objectives.
For sure. I wasn't calling you out on that. I was just like,
no.
Quicker than that.
I think the point is, that's the agitation that we need, though, right? Like,
right.
Are we urgent? Forget 20 years. Yeah, 2. Like, how do we bring that in? Bob, I see that you have a lot of questions in the chat. If you want to filter those, or people are welcome to, because I do want to make sure that I'm giving voice to anybody that's had something. My email is Bryan, and Bryan is with a Y, at legal-innovators.com. So happy to either get answers through you or Molly, or answer directly.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure we have questions. Am I missing them? I'm just, a couple of comments, but I don't think we have any pending
It
questions.
was us talking to each other.
That was you.
Yeah.
Someone wanted
That was me talking to myself over there.
We did a webinar on mediation a couple of weeks ago, and there was like 30 comments, and then I'm trying to tell the moderator, who's my business partner, I was like, hey, we got to get the people in. So
yeah, no, I think people have appreciated just listening to your comments. They were very helpful and insightful, so appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope everybody gets out and gets a little bike ride in or something this weekend. And
happy to ride around the monuments. Anybody that lives in DC, we can meet out. All right. You guys,
all right.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And thanks you all, and good weekend. And that'll wrap it up for today.
Brilliant.
See you next week.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay in touch.